Книга называется «Биология освобождения», о том, каким образом, соответственно, современные технологии позволят нам решить ряд вопросов, в том числе морально-этических вопросов, как это связано с воздействием на генетический код, имеем ли мы право это делать и так далее. Вот. И он сегодня коснется этих вопросов и расскажет о том, как современные технологии и биология влияют на наши ценности, на нашу этику. Рональд, вам слова. Ага. Спасибо.
I hope that all of you have, those of you who need it, have the translators available. I'm delighted to be here in St. Petersburg. This is my third trip here. It's a lovely, wonderful city. I am also very grateful that you have taken in this refugee from the American presidential elections at the moment. I'm also very, very conscious of the fact that I am all that's standing between you and your Saturday evening, so I'll try to be interesting as possible. Anyway. So, the topic we have here, how technology and future values. How will technology change our values? Well, one of the first ways I want to address the issue is to look at whether or not technology has already changed our values. And that'll give us a basis, if you will, for thinking about how it might do so in events coming in the future. So, has technology changed our values already? This is just a schematic showing a lot of huge technological progress. Most of it has taken place in the last 200 years or so. And there's a particular reason for why it took place. Because there was also a change in at least some countries, if you will, political systems, their governance systems, they became open societies. Prior to 200 years ago, all societies were natural societies. By that, they were societies where there was an elite oligarchy that ran the country and basically ran patron-client networks. And the Roman Empire was that way, for example. The Mayan Empire was that way. The Chinese, all states prior to 200 years ago were essentially what we would call natural states. But because of certain historical accidents, open societies developed in Western Europe, and that began the process of allowing technology to take off for the first time. So that value shift began what I'm going to argue is a virtuous circle where technologies improve, and as our technologies improve, so too do our morals. Let's see if I can sustain that argument. Well, among many other things that happened is up until 200 years ago, average life expectancy, in fact, up until 100 years ago, average life expectancy on planet Earth was 35 years. Only 35 years. And now it is over 70 years. For the first time in all of human history, it became over 70 years on average for people on planet Earth. Obviously, not everybody lives that long. But for the first time, it became dramatically lengthened. Essentially, human longevity doubled over the last century or so. And this has had, I think, a huge effect on people's morality. Among other things, people became much more willing and accepting to value life. If you are going to have more life, you're going to value it more, and you're going to perhaps value other people's lives more. And this is to show what the changes were. In 1800, for example, what you see here is at the top, basically average life expectancy was 40 years or less. In 1950, it had started going up to, and the countries in yellow and light green and so forth had gotten over 60 years, and now it's over 70 years in the countries with green. That's just another way of illustrating that improvement as a result of technology and economic growth. Speaking of economic growth, basically what you've seen is the population of the planet has increased from about 1 billion or so up to 7.5 billion today, whereas the world GDP has increased to over 80 trillion over that period of time. Again, it's because of technologies. It's a virtuous circle. As societies become more open, you allow inventors and innovation to take place, and people to profit from what it is that they achieve. They're able to create the wealth that helps population grow, also helps life expectancy to increase. And what you end up with is, and as you look down here in 1900, average, and this is in real dollars or real currencies, Average per capita income on planet Earth was $2,000 a person. Of course, there are lots of people making much less than that, but now it's over $12,000 a person. What is the result of that? What are some moral consequences that I would argue that flow from more technology, greater wealth, greater longevity? Among many other things, what you happen is that those societies that are open societies, here, these data are based on something called Polity 4, where the researchers characterize various societies by their openness, whether they're authoritarian, whether they're democratic, etc. And what you see is that the light green and the green are increasing over time. That is, the percentage and the number of people who are living in democratic societies is increasing. These are also the societies that are most technologically innovative, as it turns out. So again, a virtuous circle continues. One of the more amazing statistics, and this is something, some research that was done by a guy named Steven Pinker, who's a researcher at Harvard University. He wrote a book, a quite wonderful book actually, I think about 3 years ago, called The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence is Declining in the World. It has in fact, I know it's astonishing given the 20th century, what we know happened in the 20th century, but as a percentage of population, the number of people who've died of violence, homicidal violence, the percentage has been declining for over 200 years. This is data starting after World War II. I realize, of course, that World War II is a big deal, but what you find is that over time, these are battle deaths, the people who died in various conflicts, civil wars, wars against colonialism, interstate wars, those kinds of things. And what you find again is the rate of death, percentage of people has been declining quite substantially. As we all know, there are certain regions of the world where violence is still quite endemic. Again, those are not open societies, they're not technologically innovative, and to a certain extent, because of that, I would suggest that their moral basis is still somewhat lagging over time. But even in those societies, percentage chances of being murdered by your fellow man are still less than they were only a century ago. And so this is a very quick way, I'm not going to go into a great deal of information on this slide, but this is a group called Social Progress Imperative. What they are, a group of researchers who try to figure out, well, as economic growth occurs, and again, economic growth occurs almost entirely because of two things, better government institutions and better technology, and those two things go together. And what you find is so for social progress, is that you get greater wealth, per capita wealth, down here at the bottom, is you get greater nutrition, education, women's rights, greater personal safety, greater freedom, greater tolerance, and more innovation over time. And so this is what they call the social progress index, and again, the places that do not have open societies, that are not innovative technologically, are still the ones that are, shall we say, somewhat behind on their ethics. So, what about the future? What technologies are going to be impinging upon the way that we organize our lives and the way that we start treating each other over time? Will they also continue what I'm arguing is that virtuous circle of innovation, both it's technological innovation, but also ethical innovation over time? And so I'm going to be discussing 5 different technologies, one of which actually gives me some pause. It's the last one, we'll get to that. But there's the blockchain, which I understand some of you have already been hearing a great deal about, so I won't go into a great detail about that. But it is an amazing technology for inculcating, if you will, virtue. Biotechnology and also nanotechnology and infotech will be enhancing humanity, the capacities of humanity, both physically and intellectually over time. And will that also have some consequences for future ethics? Then there's a trend called dematerialization. And it's largely using less stuff, less energy, less material to get more value over time. And this leads up to the question of sustainability. Is human civilization sustainable over time? And I'm going to show you some trends which I think will indicate that that is the case. Then I have one that I'm calling freedom through wealth. And this is the question of, well, will robots take all our jobs? What will we do with our time? And this is a big issue currently in a lot of countries around the world. is if automation becomes so powerful, if artificial intelligence becomes so powerful, what will we do? How will we make a living? And I'll address that in a bit. But the final one is a deep concern of mine. One of the great advantages of technology right now, a lot of the digital technologies, is that we are tracked everywhere we go. Put it this way, AT&T certainly knows where I am in the world, everywhere I am. And if my government wants to know, they can go to AT&T and ask them, where is Ron today? So this is a problem, but it's a great advantage, of course, to me, be able to be tracked, to be able to use my phone, to get whatever information I want, to send photos to my dear wife who's at home. But it means that if this information is collected, there are people who might want to use it not to my benefit. And so we'll be discussing how that might be solved as a problem as well for ethics. So the blockchain. I won't go into great detail about it, largely because I don't completely understand it myself. But it is a technology that, when I've talked to people about it, it builds trust into it by its very nature. It is a kind of distributed network, and I guess this is a very famous illustration of that, is that this is what it would be. It would be a mesh network. Right now we have centralized networks and decentralized networks, and what can happen with either of those is that malefactors, we won't call them necessarily the government, can interrupt these links and get it and make sure that we don't get the information that other people might be wanting to send us. The thing about the blockchain is that it's much harder to interrupt. It is possible, but it is much harder to interrupt. And this kind of technology is distributed across possibly, hopefully, millions of individual servers and computers at one point through networks that will be very hard to trace. And because of the way it works, it's also an open ledger. Everybody knows, it can be, that certain transactions have taken place and that those are valid transactions. In other words, you don't need to have necessarily police or courts or governments standing in the way of transactions to guard them to make sure they take place. They only take place if you agree to them taking place, among other things. So what you end up with is a world of possibly total trust, that essentially we all know what we're doing all the time, but not necessarily our government does. And these are some of the possibilities. Again, I won't go into these things, but what it is that it's a decentralized database, peer-to-peer network. It's a shared distributed ledger, a trust layer, if you will, for the web. And it will dramatically change, I'm told by the experts, and we've had some here today, financial services, government services, healthcare, energy markets, everything. But the essential thing is that it doesn't have to be a top-down system anymore. We can trust each other because of the technologies will ensure that we can trust each other. This is a huge improvement. We don't have to have enforced coercion anymore. The next thing to think about is, and I had a long lecture in Moscow concerning these technologies, but there are going to be huge changes in technology, and they're coming now to enable changes at the genetic level, but also at the nanotechnological level, and perhaps even at the information tech level. And what you'll be able to do is to cure people of all kinds of diseases that are very hard to do right now. There are treatments coming down the line that are anti-aging, that there are various companies that are working on this. A company called Alkahest in the United States. There's another one, Human Longevity, which is run by Craig Venter, who was the private entrepreneur in the United States who first sequenced the human genome and essentially beat the US government to that goal. He is working on technologies to do that. And then, of course, Google has their company called California Life Company, which is also working quite in secret at this point on various ways to rejuvenate people. But these are, just very briefly again, possible ways of treating problems that arise because of aging over time. One of them would be genome editing. And genome editing is literally 3 to 3.5 years old. This technology was discovered by two researchers only 3.5 years ago, Emmanuel Charpentier, who's a French researcher, and Jennifer Doudna, who is an American researcher in California. And this technology allows the precise editing of whole genomes. George Church at Harvard University just edited, for example, 62 separate genes all at once in pig embryos. All at once. It's not just picking one or two base pairs, but he was able to edit 62 genes in exactly the way he wanted, in a very precise way. This is an example of a treatment that has just been done, and this is a little girl in the United Kingdom named Layla Richards, who was a recipient of one of these of a treatment based on one of these genome editing techniques. It's not the CRISPR one, it's called TALENs. It works in a similar way. It's actually much more expensive. The CRISPR one, by the way, is very easy to use, I'm told. And in fact, when I get home, I'm supposed to have a kit from a company that will allow me to use CRISPR to edit bacteria on my kitchen table. So if I can do it, anyone can do it. But this little girl came down with leukemia very shortly after she was born, and none of the techniques were not working. The old standard ones were not working. And so what they did was they took off-the-shelf immune system cells, not hers, but someone else's. They edited those cells using this genome editing technique and made them compatible with her immune system. And they put them into her body, and she is now cured. And that's just the beginning of what's going to be possible with this technology. One other way to think about this technology, and this is some research that's being done, one of the things that happens when you get old is your organs wear out. Well, wouldn't it be nice to get a new heart, or a new liver, or a new pancreas? And this is research that's being done at the University of California, Davis. And what the researchers do there is use the CRISPR technology on pig embryos, where they basically suppress the genes that say, all right, make a heart. So instead, what they do is then someone needs a heart, let's say, they take your skin cell, they turn it into what are called induced pluripotent cells, which is now easily done, and these cells can become any cell in your body. So what they do then is inject the cells into the pig embryo, and then because the pig can't make its own heart, these cells move to where the heart was going to be, and it becomes the pig's heart. Only it actually matches you. It matches your body, your immune system, and it will be and as the pig grows up, it will be about the size of a heart, your heart, and could be used as a transplant. And that's just, this is just one way of using this technology that's being researched. So one of the concepts is, will this anti-aging stuff work? Will you be able to rejuvenate people? Will people be able to be younger longer? The important thing to remember about these technologies is not to make people older longer, but to make them younger longer, or in my case, to make me younger again, if possible. But there's this concept, life extension escape velocity. And the idea is, as you get older, will the technologies, the anti-aging technologies, improve faster than you get older? So that essentially what will happen is that as you get older, new technologies come along and it can rejuvenate you faster and sooner. And therefore, what would happen is the possibility of a 1,000-year lifespan. Now, what are the ethical consequences of that? There are many, and people are worried about things like overpopulation, if we can address that. But one of the things I think is actually going on is that over the course of the last century, as people's lives got longer, people began to value human life more. Not only their own, but other people's lives as well. And to think about it, is if people think that they're going to risk giving up 1,000 years instead of 30 years, how will that change their morals? How will they behave toward one another if these things are more risky over time? You have more that you'll be giving up, more chances for opportunities of love, more chances for opportunities of experience. I think that will actually benefit humanity considerably if we do radically increase human lifespan. Another trend, I have a new book out, which if anyone here is a publisher and would like to translate into Russian, I'd be happy to give you the rights to do it. I have the rights. It's called The End of Doom, Environmental Renewal in the 21st Century. And I talk about a number of different trends, global environmental trends, but one of them I talk about is dematerialization over time. what is going to happen as our civilization grows, as we have more people joining us, and as we have more technologies, more buildings, more everything. Well, one of the things that has happened, what we can see here is that the amount of actual physical stuff that it takes to get value out of something has been reduced by 75% over the last century or so. And this can continue, as I'm going to argue will continue. But one of the things, again, to think about is, and I mean, I realize this is not a perfect substitute for all these, but the fact is that your telephone does all of those things and much more than these things did when I was a college student. One of the things you wanted to make sure is you had your roommate had a phonograph, for example, and then you had your own camera. It's all in here now. It weighs what, 3 ounces? And it's going to get better than that over time. This is an example of dematerialization, but it's not only just dematerialization, it's also the improvement of the technologies. The cameras are even better than they used to be when we had big clunky cameras. The music we listen to is better and more available. It's just, the dematerialization goes all the way down. One of the cases that I talk about in the book is the following. What happens when the world moves to successful self-driving cars? And one of the things, some research has basically shown, well, what does your car do most of the day? It sits in your driveway, or it sits in a garage. It's not doing anything. You're paying for it. You're paying for the to get fuel and the insurance and the parking and what have you. So one of actually a number of analyses has shown that what you can expect to happen is that assume that Google is able to achieve a self-driving car, which I'm fairly confident will be able to do before the end of the decade. Such fleets of cars roaming around a city like St. Petersburg could replace 9 cars and provide everybody with essentially the same transportation service that they had before. These are some simulations that are run at the University of Texas and also Columbia University. So I know that St. Petersburg happens to have Uber. Now imagine Uber, a fleet of self-driving cars. They're all electric powered. When they need electricity, they just go off to the garage, plug in for an hour or two, get some, come back out on the street. And the analysis basically says that you will get the same transportation service using self-driving cars, just hailing them when you want them, for about a quarter of the cost of owning a car overall. So who wouldn't want that deal? And the second thing is that in these analyses, they did an example of what would happen in Austin, Texas. At rush hour, the longest anyone had to wait for a car to come pick them up was 5 minutes. Usually the car would be there in less than a minute. And that would replace this. And assuming that this worked, we would have fewer cars on planet Earth than we do now to supply all the transportation needs of 9 billion people. I don't know if it's going to happen, but this is kind of the way that we can see further dematerialization occurring. Dematerialization occurs because we're putting more intelligence into our systems, not because we're using more stuff. And that would help with the sustainability problems. And this is another example of dematerialization. Again, we're using far less energy to get more more value out of what we make and use and services. And then this one is fascinating to me. This is what happened to world food production. I don't know if any of you all remember, you all look much too young for that, but back in the 1960s, there was a very famous guy named Paul Ehrlich who said, hundreds of millions of people are going to starve to death despite any crash programs embarked upon now. And he said they would all starve in the 1970s, hundreds of millions of people. That didn't happen, and that didn't happen because, again, of technology. And the technology, it was in this particular case the creation of very highly productive wheat varieties. So what you see is world population has increased, food production, well, basically population doubled, food production tripled, and per capita food consumption has gone up considerably as well. Starvation still occurs, unfortunately, and again, some areas that are not open societies, that are not using technologies, but this is a specter that is going away. And interesting, here's a fascinating statistic from the World Bank from last year. For the first time in all of human history, the percentage of people living on planet Earth who live in absolute poverty is below 10%. Absolute poverty is defined by the World Bank as $1.75 a day per person. That's not great, but it is a huge improvement in human lives. And again, I think a moral improvement in that regard. But it gets better there with regard to the land use. Jesse Oswald, who is a researcher at Rockefeller University in New York City, has done the calculations, and he argues that what's going to happen is that farmers are going to become so much more productive over time that much more land is going to be released to nature. Essentially, an area of land about 5 times the size of France by 2060 will be returned to nature because farmland will become so productive over that time. And what that will mean is that people will be withdrawing from nature. One of the other positive trends in that regard is that the world is urbanizing. About 10 years ago, for the first time in history, 50% of humanity lived in cities. It is projected that by the middle of the century, 80% of humanity will be living in cities. This has a very interesting consequence. Right now, there are 3.6 billion people living on the landscape in various ways, small towns, villages, farms, that kind of thing, subsistence living. If humanity actually becomes an urban species, that 80% of us will be living in cities. And by the way, I grew up on a farm. I really love cities. But what that means is that the number of people who live on the landscape is 3.6 billion now. It'll be 1.8 billion. And this is including the increase of population that's going to occur over the next few years. 1.8 billion will be living on the landscape at that point. That means, again, more withdrawal from nature. And so what I'm projecting is that as we withdraw from nature, nature will expand again, and a lot of the concerns that people have with regard to species extinction, the forest growth and so forth, will abate over time, because we will be using far less of nature for our own purposes, and instead we will use nature for aesthetic purposes. And I think those aesthetic purposes are also moral purposes. One of the things that we can also fairly confidently predict is that even if, assuming, well, let's go back on that. Assuming that our governments do not completely screw up our economies, it's a big assumption, but assuming that that is the case, people at the end of this century are going to be vastly wealthier than we are now. Now, people think about this, well, what do you mean? How could that possibly be? I think one of the ways to look at it, at least I think about it in the context of the United States, is obviously not the rule for everybody on planet Earth, but essentially between the time my grandparents were born and my time, our economy grew essentially this amount as well. The planet, these are numbers basically from the United Nations. You know, take them with a grain of salt, but this is what's going to happen with population. It'll be increased by maybe 30, 40% over that period of time. And what you see is that per capita wealth will be going up quite considerably. These are indices. So assume that right now per capita income is $12,000 a person. We saw that earlier. If it goes up to per capita income to over 10 times that, that means per capita income on planet Earth will be $120,000 a person. That's just for the average of the planet. There will obviously be some differences in that. That buys also a lot of technology, and the great thing about technology is it becomes cheaper over time. So if you think about it, is that there'll be a consequence of not only greater wealth, but more ability to do the things you want to do because of that wealth, because of the effectiveness of the technologies that you'll have. One concern that is very popular at the moment is, well, will the robots take our jobs? First of all, this is not a new concern. This has been something, a theme throughout the entire period of industrialization. The Luddites famously in Britain in the early 19th century were breaking the various weaving machinery and so forth because they were being put out of work, that kind of thing. And in 1960, the United States had huge commissions about, oh my, automation is going to take all of our jobs. So far, what we've had is that we moved to better, easier jobs. If you think about it, and again, these are numbers for the United States because I'm much more familiar with them. As in 1900, 50% of Americans worked on farms. In 1950, 15% worked on farms, and now 2% work on farms. And where did they go? Did they all become unemployed farmers? No, they got other jobs. We'll see. But the question is it this time it's different because what we're doing is adding intelligence to our tools and to our machinery. And intelligence changes a whole, I mean, we were the ones who were using the machines. We provided the intelligence. But now if our machines can operate themselves without us, what can we do? It'll be a very interesting century to see how that's going to play out. One possible solution to this would be a basic guaranteed income. And the idea here is this very simple graphic. Most of us think, what do I need? What do I have to do to put food on the table, keep a roof over my head, and that kind of thing? But if the machines actually are able to produce wealth independently of our various activities, then we're going to have to spend some time figuring out what to do with that wealth. How will we be able to distribute it? And that will be a huge moral conundrum. And I'm not sure that there's necessarily going to be an easy solution to it. There will be a huge fight about it. But ultimately, I think that what will happen is that that wealth will be distributed in interesting and different ways. And that will be a moral conversation that we will all have to engage in if it turns out that the folks who are arguing that the robots will take our jobs are correct. I'm not completely persuaded that that will be the case, but I do want to tab it as something that we do have to think about. I do want to thank Russia for taking in Mr. Snowden. I do really want to thank Russia for doing that. He is a great hero of mine. He revealed to what great depth our own government was spying on us at home in the United States, and I'm forever grateful that he did that. But it does bring up the question of mass surveillance, and what do we do about that? I don't know if this is a good Russian line, but statism. Ideas so good, they have to be mandatory. The idea is that your government knows best and you better do it. And surveillance is unfortunately a way of making sure that that happens. Here are some things that concern me that are going on currently. And I just wrote for my magazine, I work for a magazine in the United States called Reason, R-E-A-S-O-N, and you can get us at reason.com. And I asked the following question, did Russia model its new surveillance laws on those of the West? And what provoked me to ask that question was, for example, in my country, the United States, there was a innocuously named law called Compliance with Court Orders Act of 2016. Now, it sounds, well, of course you should obey court orders, right? Well, what it basically says, when you read the fine print, is all companies must provide a backdoor to their encryption to our government so that the spies and the police and the FBI can read them so that you can comply with court orders. Unfortunately, in the United Kingdom, they just passed in June, before, in fact, the Yarovaya laws. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Yarovaya, but anyway, close enough. Anyway, the UK passed what they call the Investigatory Powers Bill, which also will require companies, digital companies, to provide backdoors to their encryption, or they'll be fined or what have you. And of course, Russia now has the Yarovaya law, which it'd be fascinating to see how that gets to be enforced. I'm not sure that the government quite understands what they're dealing with. But one solution to the problem is, this is a nice schematic here, instead of surveillance, is surveillance. This is a very nice schematic, is you can watch the watchers. And we can all watch the watchers nowadays. One of the things about surveillance versus surveillance, su means from under, by the way, it's French for under, and sur is from the top down. And what you can see is that surveillance provides for integrity because it's transparent, it's distributed, we can all do it, it's open. The people who do it basically enforce honesty on each other because we can all share that. The data have integrity. And the problem with surveillance, as we all know, is hypocrisy. No, we're not watching you. No, we're not misusing it. It's centralized, it's secret, it's corrupt. But surveillance turns the table on surveillance. And this is just an example from the news during the Republican National Convention, which thankfully I was out of the country for. Is an example where these citizens are all, if you will, using their cell phones to watch the watchers, to make sure that the cops are not misbehaving. And as we've seen in the United States, and I'm sure around the world, famously now, we have all of these videos showing misbehaving cops, policemen, in the United States. And this is getting more and more traction. The public has become very concerned about this. It used to be that you would believe the police, right? Because they're police officers, they're here for your safety. And now there's a growing skepticism in that regard. And this is an example of surveillance working. Then there's activism, and I understand that you had the head of the Russian Transparency International speak to you earlier. Good work, keep it up. But I don't know if activism is going to work. I mean, the idea is that we could all go to our governments and say, don't pass these compliance with court orders acts. Don't impose the National Security Agency on people. Do not force companies to give you backdoors for encryption. I don't know if the activism will succeed, but we should certainly try. But this is a way possibly around it. And this is probably what's going to happen, I would argue, is that we will take control for ourselves. That we will use these technologies to protect ourselves from surveillance from people that we don't want. And this can be combined with the blockchain in many ways as well. But these are just some of the many activities out there that are, for example, Tor enables browsing so that no one knows necessarily where your location is. WhatsApp is encrypted. There are 1 billion people using WhatsApp. It is encrypted end-to-end. Amusingly enough, I find it amusing anyway, in Brazil there are 100 million WhatsApp users, and there was a court that was demanding that WhatsApp decrypt a set of messages, and WhatsApp said, we can't do that. So the judge got so angry with him, he said, fine, you're now shut out of Brazil for 3 days. It was a huge fight. The people rose up and said, what are you doing? I can't talk to my friend anymore. And his order was lifted a day later. That's the way these things can work. Proton Mail is an encrypted email system out of Switzerland, which we could all sign up and use. And Silent Circle allows for video and voice communications, among other things as well, that's encrypted. So, my final question, and then we can get to the question and answer, is the following. And this is the big question on this trend, is will the technologies of freedom outpace the technologies of oppression? I'm fairly confident that they will, but only if we really care and if we have that value to do that. In any case, I hope I realize it's a very extensive lecture. A lot of questions and issues will be brought up, but I hope that it was somewhat useful, and thank you very much for listening to me on a Saturday evening.
Спасибо большое Рональду за насыщенную контентом лекцию. Да, Я думаю, что мы можем переходить к вопросу. У меня, на самом деле, очень много. Вопросы можно по-русски, как и по-английски задавать. Если вы задаете по-русски, подождите, пока Рональд, да, воспользуется переводчиком. Угу. И представляйтесь, если можно еще.
Hi, my name is Ivan. I'd like to ask about the charts that you show in the beginning, showing the growth and all the values, social reforms and inequality. Over the same period of time, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but over the same period of time, if you could chart the growth of inequality in the world, they would have demonstrated a very similar trend. Are you in any way concerned that the beneficiaries of all of these progresses would be actually a very handful and small group of the humanity, and by far not the vast majority of people?
An excellent question. Thank you for that. One thing that has to be, inequality is growing in certain of Western countries. One of them, we'll call them the United States. But the more interesting trend, and this is something that no one seems to focus on, is globally, inequality is in fact declining, and been declining fairly steeply over the last 30 years or so. If you're looking at comparisons between countries and their populations globally, inequality is declining, and fairly steeply. It is a concern to a certain extent. Why is inequality increasing in places like the United States? Given my particular values and my particular commitments and my particular analysis, I would suggest to you it is because of is a system of what we call crony capitalism, that essentially the incumbent companies, the old companies, are able to get the politicians to pass regulations and law that support their old systems, and they stand in the way of innovation. And so that system needs to be broken. And it's not a natural feature of capitalism. In fact, capitalism, as I believe the data will fairly strongly show, is a system for decreasing inequality over time. The problem is that our political system, as the nomination of Donald Trump for running for president shows, is having some problems right now. Will they be sustained? I don't think so, but it's a political issue, it's not an economic issue. And I'm hoping that people like me will be able to turn that around, but it's a good point. But the larger trend, again, is inequality globally is declining. The other thing, I can't resist this. When people are talking about inequality, and they're comparing, and my politicians do this all the time, they're always comparing the United States pre-tax versus Denmark or France or Germany post-tax, which is not really sensible, because if you actually look at the numbers, the Germans and the French and the Danes are all more unequal than the United States with regard to the top fifth versus the bottom fifth. The only reason they're not is because, in the long run, is because the rich are so highly taxed in those countries. And that maybe was necessary to do it, but I should just point out that those trends exist elsewhere as well. Anyway.
Да, спасибо. Еще вопрос? Нет вопросов? Удивительный факт.
Меня зовут Владимир. Здравствуйте, Рональд. Такой вопрос вот по поводу достижений в биологии, в генетике. Различные моралисты или представители церкви, представители традиционных различных направлений, они, как правило, тормозят развитие вот данного направления науки, проведение экспериментов, которые приблизят прогресс. Вот что вы скажете, насколько это тормозит, во-первых, развитие, и как вы видите развитие дальнейшее?
Thank you very much for the question, and that is a particular issue. I'm going to take two possible ways to think about it. For example, the Roman Catholic Church forbids their adherents to use artificial contraception, for example. They forbid them to use in vitro fertilization, for example. They forbid the use of condoms and those kinds of things. As we know, in the United States, Roman Catholics in the United States use all of those things at the same rate that anybody else does, and they still go to church. So basically, the hierarchies can say one thing, and the parishioners will go, I actually think that'll help my family a lot more than what the priest has to say. He's right about certain spiritual things, but maybe he doesn't quite get it. And so I think that adherents of various churches will do what they think best for their families. But the other side of it is, and what I would want to do, if I had Pope Francis to talk to, for example, I would take him aside, put my arm around him, and go, God is up in heaven going, I've been waiting for you people to figure out how to control your fertility. This has been a test. I gave you all this intelligence, I've given you science, and you're just standing in the way of that. Why do you think I'm against this? And I think that there is a way, and I don't want to make fun of it, but there is a way where certainly to deny human intelligence and the application of it is to deny what people who are believers think are God-given gifts. So why are you denying that gift? Why that particular thing? And I think that ultimately, I will put it this way, I think that the gifts of technology are going to be so powerful and so beneficial for people and enabling them to live flourishing lives that religions will have to accommodate themselves to it ultimately.
Да, спасибо. Ага.
What do you think about resource-based economy as a one possible option for a future economies? Resource-based economy model.
I'm not sure I understand.
Resource-based economy model is basically one inventor invented by one US scientist called, I don't remember the name, but the idea is that we don't have money in the future, all the production is automated and all the resources around the world is real-time monitored.
Is monetized.
Monitored.
Oh, I see, okay. I'm not sure I know sufficient enough to comment on that. One thing though that I think, I'll put it this way. Monitoring is, and see if I'm getting this right, is that essentially it is a form of assigning property rights to somebody. That one of the things that the blockchain can do is to make sure that people actually have control, ownership, whatever style we want to put it, of the particular object. And I'm completely in favor of assigning property rights. Here's another way of why I think about it that way. I'm going to make this statement, and I realize it's going to sound very broad, but I'll give it a go. Anything that you think is an environmental problem in the world, anything that you think is an environmental problem, is the result of a defect in property rights. It is occurring in an open access commons. Nobody owns the river, and therefore no one protects it. No one owns the forest, therefore no one protects it. No one owns the fisheries, no one protects it. The atmosphere is the same way. If you see pollution, it's because there's no one there to say, that's my property, stay away from it, or pay me for it if you're going to do something like that. And it's a much longer discussion. Again, did I mention I wrote a book called The End of Doom, where I discuss this. But if you can heal that, if you can fix property rights, you can go a long way toward fixing a lot of the environmental problems. The other thing about monitoring is, again, it's important to know who is responsible for what. And property rights is a way of holding people responsible for that. And to that extent, to the extent that I understand you, monitoring will certainly improve that. And I think that'll be good in a lot of different ways. But I may misunderstand, and what I would like you to do is please send me a link to this so that I will get that information. Thank you.
Да, спасибо.
Ronald, thanks for the lecture. I also identify myself as libertarian transhumanist, so I'm always very pleased to read your interviews or to listen to the lectures. And I have one question that I will often ask myself. Would any data or reasoning or something make you feel that you're wrong as a whole? Like in general, would you oppose freedom or progress in some case?
Would you completely change whatever you believe about the world? It would take a whole lot to do that. Let me explain a little bit of my ideological history, if I might, in that regard. When I was a college student, and this was in the 1970s, yes, the internet did not yet exist. The mammoths were roaming the landscape. Dinosaur attacks were daily. Before that, I thought I was going to be a socialist. I was impressed by the notion that we should all care for one another, that we should be able to provide for people in all sorts of different ways. But I wanted to be a socialist, and so my political commitments were in that direction. Then I made a terrible error. I signed up for an economics course. And I hated the economics course because it was telling me that people were a certain way that I didn't want to believe. So I decided I'll take more of these and prove it wrong. 3 years later, I was a libertarian. But the main thing but the motivation remained the same, and this is the critical point. The only system that has ever lifted billions of people out of natural abject poverty, the natural state of all humanity, is democratic capitalism. There has been nothing else that has achieved that goal, period. And I am a supporter of democratic capitalism, not because it makes me wealthy. I, after all, work for a non-profit, but because it makes the opportunities for poor people for them to become rich, to have the experiences that I have, to have the technologies to flourish, to make sure their families don't die of early diseases, to have other opportunities. And if you could persuade me that some sort of other system would achieve the same goal, then I would change my mind. But you have to really overcome that. You have to tell me that more poor people will be better off under that system than under a system of democratic capitalism. And I think that's a very high bar for someone to achieve, since nothing else has ever done that. Does that make sense?
Спасибо. Есть ли еще вопросы?
Здравствуйте, Рональд. Меня зовут Артем. Спасибо вам большое за эту невероятную лекцию. Это было действительно интересно. Спасибо вам, что вы приехали. Я хотел задать вопрос касательно синхронизации человека и технологий. Этот вопрос касается высокотехнологичных имплантантов, протезов. И касается он того, что, с одной стороны, они, безусловно, полезны. Они возвращают недееспособных людей, которые когда-то там потеряли конечности на войне или на работе, свои конечности какие-то, да, свою способность быть нормальным человеком, обычным человеком. Но с другой стороны, у нас встает вопрос философский. Как обычные люди, как общество будет принимать этих людей? Как людей или как роботов? Может быть, как киборгов? Как общество будет относиться к таким людям? И вопрос мой состоит в том, как можно способствовать тому, чтобы эти люди в будущем, да, может быть, не сегодня, становились действительно частью нормального общества, или мы просто вынудим людей приходом технологий, фактом прихода технологий, мы вынудим людей принимать этих людей, которые стали киборгами, можно так это называть, вот. Или все-таки есть способы того, как рассказать людям, что это действительно правильно, что это нужно делать, что эти люди не являются машинами, они остаются людьми, несмотря на то, что они синхронизируются с технологиями. Спасибо.
Very interesting question. Thank you very much. It's a very rich question. It's a very interesting thing because one of the things that's going to be happening over time is I'm fairly confident that a lot of the technologies, particularly digital technologies, electronic technologies, are going to be migrating into all of us. And we'll want them to. We will choose to have them do that over time, over the course of this century. For example, Ray Kurzweil, who is the chief engineer at Google at this point in the United States, is also a transhumanist, has argued that by the middle of next decade or so, that the cost of computation equal to a human brain will be $1,000. And I don't see any reason why that couldn't be the case, because when I think about it, is that the internet was essentially invented in 1985 when 5 university computers were hooked together in the United States. They were exchanging information at 5,000 bits per second. The fiber optic line to my house is 18,000 times faster. The world's most powerful supercomputer had less computing power than my iPhone does in 1985. So I think that essentially these technologies are going to be coming very fast. There is an accelerating trend. And so if we have available, if any one of us have available the computational power of another human brain, that will change a lot of things. We will be, what's the most critical thing is that we will all be wanting to use them in different ways. So the critical feature, the great feature, the feature that occurred over the 20th century is, and this was a huge ethical advance, was to get over tribalism, to basically begin to treat other people from other tribes as though they were people too. This is the principle of tolerance. And tolerance will be absolutely critical for the kinds of transformations that you're thinking about. Is that what we will have to think about is, I don't really care how you use this technology if you are not harming me or my family. Please go ahead and do that. And if it doesn't work for you, as my wife sometimes says, if you can't be a good example, you can be a horrible warning. There will be failures of technology, but the goal will be, again, this sense of tolerance. I think that tolerance should be increasing over time. The last decade or so would suggest that we've had a little bit of a problem globally with this at the moment, but I think the trend will reinstate itself, and that basically the people who use various technologies in different ways from the way I would want to do it, I would say, go, do it. And I think that more and more of us will do that because we also will have the like permission from them to use technologies in the way we want to use them. And if tolerance goes away, then it will be a big problem over the next century. But I don't think that it'll be a particular issue, honestly.
И у нас есть еще время на один вопрос. Ну, давайте, Айза.
Thank you for your speech. It was really great. We all know that scientists made all these inventions in genome technologies to improve our lives and to beat all diseases. But sometimes, maybe probably in the future, government or countries can use these technologies maybe to make the strongest army with super soldiers as Captain America, or make the best nation with blonde hair and blue eyes. How can we, like human beings, prevent these Nazis, like this thing?
We know these countries.
First of all, I want to assure you, some of my best friends have blonde hair and blue eyes. What's interesting is, and this is the sad truth of the matter, these technologies will become cheaper over time, no doubt about it, but have any dictators had any problem getting people to fight for them and murder their fellow human beings at all? It's a lot cheaper to go for the natural human beings that you have around you and talk them into joining an army to go murder somebody else. I cannot honestly imagine, at this point, a dictator going, all right, let's clone some super soldiers, let's train them for 10 years, 20 years, and then let's go invade a country 21 years from now. Dictators are not that patient, or at least haven't been so far. I don't really think that the technology will be abused in that way. There are other ways it could be abused, obviously. You could, and I'm a little more concerned about that, is that you might try to create biotech plagues that could kill lots of people, for example. And governments have actually tried to do that in the past, both the United States government and the Soviet government during that period. But the interesting thing is they failed. And part of the reason they failed is not just because of a lack of technology, but it turns out that nature is constantly trying to figure out how to create microbes to kill all of us. And it's been trillions of experiments every hour going on, trying to figure out how to kill us. And it turns out that we're pretty good at preventing that, just in our nature. So it would be really hard to come up with something. I'm not saying it's impossible to do, but it would be really hard to come up with something better than nature has already tried to do. I mean, if you think about tuberculosis and smallpox, they literally killed hundreds of millions of people. And no government came up with those. It will be hard to come up with something like Ebola that you could treat like a bad cold. That's just going to be hard to do. So I'm not particularly worried in that regard. I guess the other safeguard, and I would hope that we can all do this, and that's kind of why I'm playing with this CRISPR technology on my kitchen table, is the more widespread biological information is, and the more widespread sensors are, the more we're able to monitor each other and what people are doing with their experiments, the more we can protect ourselves. One of the other things, if you think about it, is how quickly now a new outbreak of a disease can be identified. It used to be you had to have several 100,000 people die somewhere in some remote area, and then all of a sudden it came out. HIV took forever to figure out. But when the SARS virus came out of China, within 2 months the world knew about it, and we're already working on a vaccine. And that was 6 years ago, or no, it was more than 10 years ago. That won't happen again. We will be able to very quickly detect those kinds of things very much more easily in the future and start to deal with them in a fast way, if we can get the regulators out of the way. But that's another discussion for another time. Anyway, I do appreciate you all very much for spending your Saturday evening with me. Please go have a vodka. Enjoy.
Спасибо большое. Спасибо вам большое, что пришли. Да, я хотел бы сказать о том, что вот лекция Рональда, которую он читал в Москве, будет доступна на сайте Liberty. Там же можно прочитать недавнее интервью Рональда и многих других, на самом деле, спикеров, которых мы приглашали в Москву, достаточно именитых. Рональд у нас заканчивал блок лекций, которые касаются ценностей, этических вопросов. Скоро у нас стартует новый блок, сейчас идет блок касательно лжи, касательно несправедливости. Поэтому приглашаю на сайт Liberty, заходите, там хороший, качественный контент. Спасибо вам большое за то, что пришли.
I'm not a political transhumanist, I'll put it that way.
Is it a problem?
But the point is that you have to keep doing it, and eventually it'll catch on. And one of the things that will happen is, let's say, when these technologies really takes off, and then they will be right there ready to articulate But it's an old technology. It's called lives. Right? It's saying you can do any. I don't know. Fly home tomorrow. I understand. What's interesting is that you don't want to burn oil. You want to be warm. You don't want to have rain, get out of the rain. You want to have shelter system. So these are ones that are always being met by technology. Largely, I think, the same wants will be met with less and less material and more intelligence. So you'll still be consuming heat, but you won't be consuming oil. Does that make sense? But the
about the amount of stuff each have
what will happen is that you'll shift, I would argue, you'll shift away from the stuff to the experiences. That what you will want to do, for example, is you won't need the stuff because you won't need the car for coming home. But instead, because transportation will be so much cheaper, you'll go more places. But that's not going to happen. That will be an industry that will be changing and getting smaller. What we will be consuming more of is experience, not stuff. But experience costs money too. The people have to give that to you, to take you places, to show you things, to create art for you, to create a fantastic movie for you, to create a virtual reality for you to play in. Somebody has to provide those services as well. So it's not going to be the stuff. It's going to be more about value. Yeah, more of your emotions and more of your aesthetic needs will be, or the economy runs on at that point.
My wife likes
She'll be able to print them out at home if she wants, and then throw them back, and they will go back into the recycling. No, I mean 3D printing.
Yes.
Yeah, right. So she could wear a different one every day, and then throw it back in recycling, and not have it. So she doesn't have to have a closet anymore. So. Well, no, if anyone is interested in publishing in commercial, I would be happy to do that.
Да, спасибо тебе.
I
Нормально прошло все?